I want to welcome the members of the House Armed Services Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee and the House Foreign Affairs Asia-Pacific Subcommittee to a special joint hearing on the topic of maritime disputes in the South China Sea. I also want to extend a warm welcome to our two witnesses, Ms. Colin Willett, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategy and Multilateral Affairs in the State Department's Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and Mr. Abraham Denmark, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. I thank you both for being here to testify at this special joint hearing. Our topic today is a timely and critically important one. Early next week, the Permanent Court of Arbitration is expected to rule on the legitimacy of China's expansive territorial claims in the South China Sea. In the aftermath of that ruling, the world will be watching two things. First, to see whether China behaves like a responsible stakeholder in the international system, and if not, to see how America responds. For decades, the United States has sought to facilitate China's integration into the global economy and the rules-based international order that has benefited Asia so well. China's reaction to next week's ruling will provide a clear indicator of how that's going and whether Beijing's quest for regional dominance can be curbed by international law and world opinion. America's response will also send a powerful signal. While the United States does not take sides in territorial disputes, we can and should stand up for those parties that pursue their peaceful resolution. The Philippines is one such party, but not the only one. And what we do or don't do to support our allies in the rules-based international system in the weeks ahead will have echoes across the region and in other corners of the globe. With so much at stake in the South China Sea, it's critically important that the United States have a clear policy toward the region and a strategy to sustain peace, prosperity, and the rule of law in Asia. Diplomacy will play a crucial role in avoiding and resolving conflict, and I'm pleased to have Ms. Willett and members of the HFAC committee with us here today to discuss that critical aspect of any interagency approach to the region. If China continues to flaunt international law and world opinion, however, I firmly believe that the surest way of averting another devastating conflict in the Asia-Pacific region will be for the United States to remain present, engaged, and capable of projecting decisive military power in the region. Might does not make right, but it can be used to deter threats to peace, prosperity, and the rule of law. That's why I've been pleased to see an increase in U.S. naval and military presence in the region and an increase in the frequency of our freedom of navigation operations. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Denmark about what the Department of Defense is doing to deter Chinese aggression, reassure our allies and partners, and maintain a favorable military balance in the Asia-Pacific region going forward. I now turn to my good friend and colleague, Mr. Courtney, the ranking member of the subcommittee on Sea Power and Projection Forces, for any comments that he may have. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to yourself and to Mr. Salmon for organizing today's hearing, which, again, as you stated, could not be more timely, given the fact that proceeding that the eyes of the world have been watching for over a year or so is about to come to a climax with a decision by the UN Hague Convention in terms of resolving this question about maritime claims in the South China Sea. Again, the stakes are huge, trillions of dollars of commercial sea traffic and products pass through the South China Sea every single year. There are numerous stakeholders in terms of different nations, maritime nations that are adjacent to it, and obviously the U.S. Navy and the U.S. as a nation has huge interests at stake in terms of making sure that international norms are followed and that have been followed for the last 70 years in the wake of World War II, and that hopefully we're going to continue to see that rule of law continue after the Hague's decision. I think I have a written statement which I'm going to ask to be submitted, and I'm just going to briefly end by saying that one way to sort of frame this question is that in September of 2015, 5 Chinese naval ships entered U.S. territorial waters off the coast of Alaska. In acknowledging the transit of these vessels, the United States made clear we viewed this action as well within the rights of China and any other nation to conduct innocent passage through legitimately established territorial seas and non-threatening military activities within exclusive economic zone of another country. The question is whether or not that same standard, which we scrupulously followed, is going to be adhered to in the South China Sea. And again, the Navy, as we've heard on the Armed Services Committee, has been conducting these freedom of navigation operations over the last 6 months, 12 months or so, again, well within our rights under UNCLOS. And really that's what I think our policy should be, which is to just basically have a single standard across the board, whether it's up in the Alaskan waters or in the South China Sea. And, obviously, we have a huge amount at stake, as I said earlier, but we are also, I think, the nation that really a lot of our allies in the region are looking towards in terms of leadership and really, again, following through on what I think is really the only path forward in terms of assuring that international maritime activity is going to continue peacefully and productively for all the stakeholders that are affected. So again, I have a written statement which I'd ask to be entered in the record, and with that I'd yield back.
Without objection, all the written statements will be entered as part of the record. And now it is my privilege to recognize another good friend and colleague, the Chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific, Mr. Matt Salmon of Arizona. Any remarks he may have.
Thank you very much, Chairman Forbes. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to join you in convening this important and timely joint hearing. The territorial disputes in the South China Sea may represent the most significant long-term security challenge in our shared jurisdiction. Our conversations about this topic are often complicated by the minutiae of territorial seas, baselines, and high tide elevations, but it is important for us to remember today what the South China Sea dispute boils down to: one nation turning away from the peaceful mechanisms of international law and peaceful coexistence and instead embracing belligerence. Congress, the administration, and other counterparts across the world recognize the severity of the threat posed by China's aggressive, coercive actions in the South China Sea that undermine international norms. Our Secretary of Defense and the President himself regularly list the South China Sea among the world's most concerning international friction points and raise it at the highest levels with their Chinese interlocutors, including Chinese President Xi Jinping. Analysts around the world pore over the disputes, and the United States has undertaken a series of highly publicized freedom of navigation operations to contest China's outrageous claims. Alarmingly, all of this attention seems to have had little effect. Tensions in the sea continue to mount, and China has established effective control of many areas by building capable military facilities on top of disputed features. In light of these trends, today's hearing could not come at a better time. In the coming days, weeks, and months, the South China Sea territorial disputes will present a series of especially important challenges. Our response to these challenges has the potential to reverse the trend of escalating tensions or to cause further injury to the peaceful, rules-based international order. I'd like to touch briefly on a few of these challenges. First, the arbitral tribunal deciding the Philippines' legal case against China recently announced that it will conclude its decision on July 12th. Although China is legally bound, and I repeat, they are legally bound to its result, it has refused to participate and has clearly said it will not comply. I'm concerned that many seem to have written off China's noncompliance as a foregone conclusion. We must remember that this case is the most significant, substantial approach to settling disputes in the South China Sea through a peaceful, equitable process. China should be held accountable to the tribunal's ruling. The Scarborough Shoal represents another critical test. China and the Philippines have come to the physical confrontation over this site before, and recent rumors hint that China may soon extend its island-building campaign to the shoal. Despite how near Scarborough is to Philippine shores, its disputed status makes it unclear whether it's covered by the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. This uncertainty means that if aggression around Scarborough Shoal is not handled properly, the very credibility of such treaties could be damaged. These treaties are anchors of hub and spoke alliance system in the Pacific, and damage to them could have dire consequences on American influence and security in the region. Finally, I want to mention the continuing threat posed by China's ability to declare an air defense identification zone over the South China Sea. I'm concerned we have few direct options to counter this type of escalation if China chooses to pursue it. China's network of airstrips, radars, missile batteries constructed across the South China Sea while the rest of the world watched may provide a capacity to enforce such an ADIZ. While the United States military would never recognize such a zone, commercial carriers will likely comply with China's notification requirements as they have under China's ADIZ in the East China Sea. China will once again unilaterally have changed the status quo. These and countless other challenges posed by the South China Sea territorial disputes will continue to test the United States and our allies. Though the answers are sometimes not easy to find, I'm really glad we came together today to hold this joint hearing, and working towards solutions and keeping the issue at the forefront of foreign policy and national security agendas is critical, and I appreciate the opportunity. Yield back.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And with that, I'd like to yield to the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific, Mr. Sherman, for any comments.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be a little bit of a contrarian, but if I just agreed with everybody who had just spoken, it would be so boring. It's my view that the power in making decisions in any important area of our policy is often under the control of the domestic organization that has power and cares about that policy. So when it comes to TPP, Wall Street wants it, Wall Street will probably get it. When you look at the Pentagon and its needs, we see that for 150 years, every time our military forces have confronted a worthy, symmetrical, uniformed adversary, it has ended with glory for our armed forces. From the Spanish-American War through the victory over the Soviet Union without a major conflagration. And every time we have faced a non-uniformed, asymmetrical opponent, it has been a terrible experience for our military, from the Philippine insurrection right up until the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Not that we're always unsuccessful, but it has never been gloriously easy. And so it's not surprising that the Pentagon is looking for a worthy adversary. And there's only one available in the world, and that is China. And so we are told that we should spend hundreds of billions of dollars focused on developing new technologies and procuring new weapon systems for the purpose of confronting China in the South China and East China Sea. Not only are we subject to this, but China is subject to it as well. In China, there is one institution at the center of making decisions. That is the Communist Party. And that Communist Party suffers a great crisis of legitimacy. People all over China are asking, why are these guys running things? Their old answer was they're running things because they're the vanguard of the proletariat. Not so much. Then they said, shut up, we're giving you 10% economic growth. I'd be inclined to switch political parties if I could achieve 10% annual economic growth, but the Communist Party can no longer do that. So the Communist Party of China is retreating into the last refuge of scoundrels and illegitimate governments, and that is exaggerated nationalism, and the best way for them to do that is to focus on these islands. The amount of cost that we are incurring as we build toward this confrontation, again, is hundreds of billions of dollars. We don't have a good cost accounting system for our military to tell us what weapon systems relate to what international threats and what foreign policy objectives. But every time I talk to the Pentagon about research and procurement, they say, Sherman, we're not interested in doing research on anything unless it shoots down Chinese planes over the South China Sea. There are other things that we confront, particularly a war on terrorism, where research is called for. Now, we're told that these islands are of such great importance. they have remained uninhabited even though they are off the shore of the most teeming and populated continent. They've been uninhabited for millennia. We're told that trillions of dollars of trade goes through these islands. That's all trade going in and out of Chinese ports, which means if China were able to militarize these islands, they would be able to blockade their own ports. We're told that there's economic value in minerals, and none of which have happened, but we are sure of one thing, and that is if there is any oil, it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to Japan, the Philippines, China, whoever owns these islands. And keep in mind, all of our allies want us to spend hundreds of billions of dollars defending their islands, which may or may not have any economic value at all, but they're never willing to spend more than 1%, maybe 2% of their GDP to defend their islands or their countries. So I'm not saying we should surrender to China, but we should not surrender to the urge to exaggerate. We should be careful, and we should relax. I'm not pro-China, I'm pro-Ambien, America's leading sleep product. There are many situations in the world where countries make outlandish claims that can be quietly resisted without turning the Pentagon on its head, spending hundreds of billions of dollars, developing new lethal technologies, and reorienting our foreign policy and our military policy toward dealing with one particular outlandish claim. So we need to resist calmly China's claims in the South China Sea.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Willett, we are glad to have you with us today, and Mr. Denmark. And before I turn to your testimony, I want to make one procedural motion. I ask unanimous consent that non-subcommittee members be allowed to participate in today's hearing after all subcommittee members have had an opportunity to ask questions. Is there an objection? Hearing none, non-subcommittee members will be recognized at the appropriate time for 5 minutes. And with that, Ms. Willett, we want you to take all the time you want, as long as you can get it within that 5-minute allotment that we have given there to give us your thoughts and your comments. And again, your written testimony will be made part of the record. So thank you for being with us, and we turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Forbes and Chairman Salmon. It's a great opportunity to appear before this.
Willett, I'm going to ask you to do what they asked me to do. Can you get a little closer to that mic? Sometimes they just aren't very sensitive and don't pick it up. Thank you.
Sure. So thank you, Chairman Forbes and Chairman Salmon, for the opportunity to appear before this joint subcommittee hearing today. It's a very timely issue. It's a very important issue. The importance of the South China Sea to global commerce and to regional stability, I think, is well known. Its economic and strategic significance means the United States has a vested interest in ensuring that territorial and maritime issues are managed peacefully. Next week, we'll present an important milestone in the South China Sea disputes. On July 12th, the Arbitral Tribunal, convened under the law of the Sea Convention, is set to issue a decision on the Philippines' submissions relating to the application of the Convention to the South China Sea. The Philippines has asked the tribunal to rule on a number of issues, particularly on the validity of China's 9-dash line and on the maritime entitlements generated by various land features in the South China Sea. Such a ruling has the potential to narrow the areas which can legitimately be considered subject to dispute based on maritime zones generated from contested land features, as well as the undisputed mainland coasts of Southeast Asian claimants. While the tribunal will not address the underlying sovereignty claims to land features, the decision does have the potential to crack the door open to a new modus vivendi among the parties that would help manage tensions in those disputed spaces. It is possible to envision a diplomatic process among the claimants that would explore different ideas for managing marine resources in areas that all relevant parties agree are subject to competing claims. Such a path towards cooperation is achievable if claimants have the political will, flexibility, and creativity to find reasonable and practical arrangements that could serve as starting points for addressing these long-standing tensions. Conversely, an adverse reaction to the tribunal ruling could become a source of increased tension. The law of the sea convention makes clear that the absence of a party or failure of a party to defend its case shall not constitute a bar to the proceedings, and that a decision by the tribunal shall be complied with by the parties to the dispute, in this case, the China and the Philippines. The world will be watching to see whether China chooses a path of diplomacy and cooperation or continues to walk along one of confrontation with its neighbors. The U.S. approach to the disputes aims to reduce the risk of conflict and preserve space for diplomatic solutions, including by pressing all claimants to exercise restraint, maintain open channels of dialogue, lower their rhetoric, and behave responsibly in the sea and in the air, and acknowledge that the same rules and standards must apply to all. The international community has an interest in maintaining a peaceful and stable South China Sea and preserving a rules-based regional system. As such, we will keep the South China Sea and maritime cooperation at the top of the agenda in the region's multilateral forums, while also working bilaterally with the relevant countries. We will continue to ensure that problematic behavior is exposed and censured. We are engaging closely with all of the claimants at all levels of government, as President Obama did in his recent trip to Vietnam, and Secretary Kerry did at the Strategic and Economic Dialogue in Beijing last month. We are working with Southeast Asian coastal states to improve their maritime domain awareness, maintain effective presence in their claimed waters, and enable them to increase communication and collaboration amongst themselves. A common operating picture can help prevent unintended escalations and improve levels of cooperation. For these countries, having a steady and consistent presence is an important demonstration that they have no intention of relinquishing their legitimate maritime rights. These diplomatic and capacity-building efforts rest on top of our robust and durable U.S. military presence in the region, which my colleague will discuss in greater detail. But let me underscore that the United States will not hesitate to defend our national security interests and to honor our security commitments to our allies and partners. The United States has been an important partner in protecting the security and stability of the Asia-Pacific region for decades, and we will continue to protect our rights and the rights of all nations to fly, sail, and operate wherever the international law allows. I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and look forward to discussing.
Ms. Willett, thank you. Mr. Denmark, we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Chairman Forbes, Chairman Solomon, ranking members, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for...
Denmark, could you do the same thing? Could you get a little closer?
Thank you for inviting me and Deputy Assistant Secretary Willett to testify before you today on this important issue. I'd like to thank both of the committees for your leadership in supporting our nation's robust engagement across the Asia-Pacific. The South China Sea is an area of immense economic and strategic importance. For decades, it has been a critical operational area for our military, and it's central to our strategy of strengthening a principled, rules-based order that enables regional stability and prosperity. This afternoon, I'll describe a region at a crossroads with the upcoming UN Arbitral Tribunal and what actions the Department of Defense is taking to preserve regional stability for decades to come. At the center of the South China Sea disputes are a series of competing claims among Brunei, China, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. While the U.S. takes no position on competing territorial sovereignty claims, we do take a strong position on protecting and upholding the rights, freedoms, and lawful uses of the sea and airspace guaranteed to all. And we seek to uphold key principles at the heart of a rules-based international order, including customary international law, unimpeded lawful commerce, freedom of navigation and overflight, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. We do have concerns about the actions by any claimant that may have an effect of eroding these principles. China, in particular, has undertaken a series of initiatives that set it apart from other claimants, reclaiming 3,200 acres in the Spratly Islands, building harbors, logistical facilities, and military-grade airfields as it deploys military assets to these features, and using low-intensity coercion to enhance its presence and ability to control the South China Sea. At the same time as China has been building outposts, another process has also been playing out. In just 5 days, on July 12th, a United Nations Permanent Court of Arbitration Tribunal will issue a ruling on these disputed features. The ruling will mark an important crossroads for the region it will present an opportunity for those in the region to determine whether the Asia-Pacific's future will be defined by adherence to international laws and norms that have enabled it to prosper, or whether the region's future will be determined by raw calculations of power. In light of this key inflection point, I'd like to briefly describe what we're doing in the region to preserve regional stability. The United States has undertaken a whole-of-government approach in the South China Sea, with the Department of Defense working in lockstep with the State Department and others to support our diplomacy with a robust military capability. I'd like to outline the 4 broad DoD efforts that have supported the broader USG strategy. First, the Department of Defense has been providing a credible capability in the South China Sea and the region to deter conflict and to create space for our diplomatic efforts to succeed. We've increased our military presence, and we're ensuring our presence is geographically distributed, operationally resilient, and politically sustainable. Second, we've enhanced our tempo of military operations. From exercises to freedom of navigation operations and presence operations, DoD continues to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows so that others can do the same. Third, we're enhancing our regional security network through building partner capacity, training, and exercises, particularly through our engagement with ASEAN. And finally, we're engaging China directly to reduce risk. We consistently encourage China to take actions that uphold the shared principles that we've served so many in the Asia-Pacific so well. We seek to keep lines of communication with Beijing open, to improve our cooperation in areas of mutual interest, and to speak candidly and constructively manage differences when we disagree. These efforts have set the stage for our engagements following the upcoming decision from the UN Arbitral Tribunal. DoD will provide critical support to our diplomacy by providing a credible deterrent against the use of force and in favor of the peaceful resolution of these disputes. We will continue to defend ourselves, our allies and partners, our interests, and our principles. Mr. Chairman, ranking members, distinguished members of the committees, the upcoming UN Arbitral Tribunal ruling provides an opportunity for the region to stand firm in our enduring commitments to a principled order in the Asia-Pacific and the rest of the world. And it is an opportunity for us to reconfirm our commitment to work with the region to ensure a principled future, one in which all people have the opportunity to live in peace and prosperity. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our questions.
Mr. Willett, Mr. Denmark, thank you both for being here. Let me ask you this, Mr. Denmark. Is there any military significance to Scarborough Shoal, to the United States?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The military value of Scarborough is not intrinsic to the feature itself. It's highly variable, dependent on if a claimant were to emplace military capabilities on Scarborough, it would be highly variable dependent on the specific capabilities that have been emplaced. So to my mind, the value of Scarborough is one of strategic importance in that it would increase a claimant's ability, de facto ability to control the South China Sea, and would, I think, marginalize a principled international order in which countries refrain from occupying and constructing and deploying military assets to previously unoccupied features.
Ms. Willett said that we'll do everything necessary to defend the national security interest of the United States and allied defense rights. If you did have a militarization of the Scarborough Shoal, would that have any impact on our national interest or our allied defense rights?
Well, Mr. Chairman, it's very difficult for me to comment to any degree of specificity on potential future hypotheticals.
That's not, well, we need to, don't we need to know? I mean, don't we need a strategy to be able to answer those kind of questions? Or, I mean, are we saying we don't have a position based on the Department of Defense right now as to whether or not there's any military significance there, and if it does have military significance, as to whether or not it would impact our national security interest?
Well, Mr. Chairman, as I said, that the military significance of Scarborough is not intrinsic to the feature itself, but rather what would be emplaced upon it. So it's difficult for me to react, to guess as how it would react because there's such a wide degree of variability.
Is there anything you could tell us as to what would constitute the militarization of Scarborough Shoals?
Militarization is not a term that we've used. The term was introduced, as you know, sir, during diplomatic exchanges with the Chinese. We look to resolve these issues through diplomacy.
I understand. We want everybody to take a breath and be calm, but at some point in time, they don't always do that. And so if we were to have a situation, they say they're not going to militarize those islands. If they were to militarize those islands, would that be contrary to the national security interest of the United States?
Again, sir, I think it's too, the variability in what could be
So the
placed on various
Department of
features is
Defense,
too-
through you, can't give us an opinion as to whether or not you think the militarization of the Scarborough Shoal would be against the national security interests of the United States.
In terms of, you asked me, sir, what I can comment upon is the military implications of this.
Okay?
And in terms of military implications, as I said, the variability based on what could be placed on any of these features is extremely broad. And so therefore it's difficult for me to hypothesize about how we may react or respond to what may be put on any one of these features.
Okay. Let me ask you this then. The 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty binds the United States and the Philippines were bound to respond to attacks on the armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft of the other party, as well as island territories under its jurisdiction. Has the United States, or either through Department of Defense or the State Department, even made an analysis of whether or not it thinks the Scarborough Shoal is an island territory under the jurisdiction of the Philippines?
Well, sir, treaties tend to be, the specific meaning of treaties tend to be handled by the State Department. So let me, before I turn things over to my colleague, let me just say, as I've said in my written testimony, as Das Willett mentioned in her statement, that we retain an ironclad commitment to the defense of our allies, and that's something that we'll not hesitate to follow through with.
Ms. Willett?
Absolutely. Mr. Chairman, the United States does not take a position on disputes over land features, and the Scarborough Shoal is disputed.
How would you interpret your treaty responsibilities if it says island territories under the Philippine jurisdiction? How would you make the determination as to whether that was or was not under the jurisdiction of the Philippines?
Scarborough Reef is a disputed feature, and we don't take a position on whose claim is more legitimate.
So if there was a dispute with China over whether or not one of their vessels belonged to them or to the Philippines, the United States wouldn't make a decision over that?
I think the language in the Mutual Defense Treaty is clear in terms of its applicability to persons and vessels from the Philippines.
Is it not clear about island territories under its jurisdiction?
Scarborough Reef is a disputed feature that we don't recognize any country's sovereignty over. That said, our treaty commitment to the Philippines is absolutely ironclad. This is something that we would take very seriously. And any move to occupy a currently unoccupied feature or further militarize currently occupied features is very dangerous, and it's very destabilizing, and I think something that would concern not just us, but the other countries in the region.
And I'm going to try one more bite at this, then I'm going to give it to Mr. Courtney. I understand it would be very destabilizing. Military actions always are. What my concern is, we have a treaty, and at some point in time, we have to make an analysis or determination what's in that treaty and what's not in that treaty. We specifically state in here armed forces, public vessels, aircraft. Then we talk about island territories under its jurisdiction. At some point in time, the United States has to make its own legal determination as to whether or not they think those vessels belong to the Philippines or the aircraft belong to the Philippines. Are you saying that any time somebody just puts that in dispute, that the United States is going to step back and not defend that?
No, I mean, I think that the language in the treaty is clear. In the specific case of Scarborough Reef, the land feature itself is disputed.
Okay. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Willett, I'd just like to drill down with you a little bit about UNCLOS and its history and just sort of the structure of how that treaty operates. Again, in terms of how past cases have played out, I think your testimony mentioned India and Bangladesh had a dispute which went through the arbitration process, and it ended up with a peaceful resolution. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And it had been a long-standing claim over many years that led up to that decision. But again, the sort of moral and global force of the UNCLOS kind of prevailed at the end of the day to have a positive outcome.
Yes, I think that's correct. I mean, I think there are actually numerous examples within the region where countries have effectively used legal dispute resolution mechanisms to settle territorial, including maritime territory disputes amongst themselves. And so it can be a very effective tool for upholding that rules-based system.
But there's no sort of UNCLOS SWAT team that's out there. So that, again, in terms of enforcing a ruling, I mean, it's really something that sort of uses, as I said, sort of the international, standing as a way of trying to get people to work within the rule-based system that it created. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. UNCLOS protects the rights of all nations, whether they have maritime entitlements themselves or not, to a specific standards for use of the seas. So it protects globally everyone's right to legally use international waters around the world. And so I think the pressure comes from an understanding that we all benefit from having an international system for regulating how seas can be used that benefits all of us.
Right. So over the last year or so, though, I mean, it appears that China has been trying to sort of step outside that structure and sort of negotiate sort of on a bilateral basis with countries in the region there to sort of, again, establish their own agreements regarding, the issues that are really under the jurisdiction of UNCLOS. Is that sort of the pattern that you've seen? The salami slicing, as they call it?
Yes, Congressman, I think you've hit on it exactly, that the fundamental issue at stake in the South China Sea is it's not about the rocks, it's about the rules. Is China, as it becomes a global sort of player and as its interests expand, is it going to play by the same rules as the rest of the globe does, whether that's in terms of the law of the sea or trade law or what have you? The question that's posed right now is China going to play inside that rules-based system that has benefited all of us so much over the last 70 years. Right.
So during the course of this proceeding, I mean, it's my understanding that the U.S. actually tried to obtain observer status in the the litigation that took place there, and we actually were denied that opportunity because the U.S. Senate has never ratified UNCLOS. Is that your understanding, or is that your testimony?
Yes. The Obama administration, like all previous administrations, believes very firmly that our interests would be served by ratifying the Convention on the Law of the Sea. We did request observer status at the hearings held by the arbitral tribunal, but because we are not a party to the convention, we're not able to participate. And it does harm us that we have not yet ratified the convention. It's a common criticism when we speak out about the importance of these rules when we ourselves have not signed up.
And that's frankly an observation that's been made by our military leadership as well. I mean, Admiral Richardson, has testified to that effect. General Dunford has testified to that effect, and Admiral Harris, who's out there in the middle of all this with the 7th Fleet and PACOM, has said that really it's time for this country to move forward and ratify UNCLOS. And again, as we get closer to the decision, frankly, I think hopefully our friends in the upper chamber will understand that this is not just some sort of parlor game in Washington. I mean, it has real life effects in terms of trying to, again, maintain what I think has been a rules-based system of maritime law, and that we benefit from it in many respects even more so than other countries.
Would my friend yield?
Sure.
Just for, to add to, my understanding is that by not being a member and the Chinese being a member, they actually can influence all the committees and subcommittees, and we can't. And so in terms of doing the actual work of the law of the seas, we're day-to-day at a disadvantage, and they are day-to-day at an advantage. I don't know if Ms. Willett wants to confirm that, but I think my friend from Yulee.
Well, all I would just point out is there's a House Resolution 631 urging the Senate to ratify, and hopefully today some members will take a look at that who maybe haven't signed on to it, because as I said, next week is the eyes of the world are going to be on this treaty and its benefits, and certainly, I mean, I think what we've heard without specifics this morning or this afternoon is really that we're going to be part of whatever that sort of international force to make sure that the decision is really adhered to, and that again we have that single standard that really I think is so important, and that UNCLOS is really focused on creating. We all benefit from that. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Tillman.
Thank you. When I first started serving on the Foreign Affairs Committee, it was 1995. Warren Christopher was the Secretary of State, and I remember asking the question in a hearing like this, what was our State Department policy toward China? And the answer kind of astounded me, yet it's been a policy of many administrations. He called it strategic ambiguity. I thought that was the oddest policy I'd ever heard. And having been to China myself probably close to 50 times and speaking the language, living in Taiwan for a couple of years, being around them a lot of time, I think this is a country we need to have some real strategic clarity with. And I think one of the reasons that things are getting so out of control in the South China Sea is that everybody's kind of dancing around the 800-pound gorilla in the room. China has stated pretty openly that with this arbitral tribunal decision that's expected in a couple weeks, that they don't intend to adhere to it. So then what? I guess that's my question. What are our options then? A lot of our allies in the region are extremely concerned about China's land grabbing, and as the chairman of the House Committee said, that not only island grabbing, but putting military installations on those islands. And so virtually all of our allies in the region have expressed grave concerns about what China is doing, and they're waiting on us to do something. And what is that something? If they flout the decision by the tribunal, what's our next move? Because I think all eyes are going to be watching us. I know we don't specifically have any land disputes ourselves, but our allies do. The other concern I have is that I think that the South China Sea is a real tinderbox. Whenever President Obama or Secretary Kerry talks about, or Ash Carter talks about the South China Sea, it's always one of the top national security concerns that we have. It's always delineated as such. And so what I'm wondering, with a lot of the close encounters with the ships and the planes, just one wrong move at any given time could escalate into a major conflict, a major problem. What is our recourse if they just flout that decision?
So, to your point about China, Mr. Chairman, it is a big and obviously very strategically important relationship to the United States. It's one that has grown dramatically over the last several years, but one that contains disagreements, but also contains a great deal of areas where we have common interests and can cooperate fairly effectively. And I would say that that dialogue, that cooperation has grown quite a bit over the last several years. It is true that we still have areas of disagreement, but part of that is our continued dialogue and our continued cooperation has allowed us to be able to deal with those areas pretty frankly. Now, there are areas, and the South China Sea is a clear example, where we continue to have a very significant difference of opinion and a great deal of friction. Our strategy overall from day one has been multifaceted. It includes diplomatic, military, capacity building, and economic tools aimed at shaping the strategic environment such that flouting the rules-based order and not playing by the same rules as others, the incentives aren't there, and ensuring that the effects of coercion or law-breaking aren't positive. The net effect of what we are seeing is a situation where no claimant can expect to flout the law, flout the ruling in a way that doesn't draw international approbation and interest and a great deal of scrutiny. And in fact has resulted in a situation where we're seeing a much greater demand for U.S. security presence, U.S. security cooperation, U.S. engagement, and we've seen much greater interest in economic diversification, including interest in TPP, expanded security ties to other regional players such as India and Japan, such that flouting international law, pushing back, behaving in a way that is not consistent with the rules-based order isn't paying the dividends that it might otherwise. And I believe that our intensive diplomatic, economic, and military engagement has played an important role in creating an environment where the payoff just isn't worth it. I think it's clear that Southeast Asian claimants continue to stand up for their rights and push back against efforts to coerce and bully them. We've seen a great deal of growth in multilateral cooperation on these big strategic issues, and I would expect that to continue.
What can we do to encourage ASEAN to step up to the plate in a bigger way? Because heretofore, I know that most of the ASEAN members, because I've met with them, they are all very concerned about what's going on in the South China Sea and Chinese belligerence. But ASEAN as a group has yet to be incredibly effective at one strong voice to deal maybe some reputational harm to China. What can we do to help maybe make that stronger, that response from them?
Well, thank you. ASEAN has actually been a consistent voice for international law and an international rules-based system for the nearly 50 years that they've existed. But you are correct, Mr. Chairman, that their institution has some limitations. There have been some instances and some limitations to their ability to speak out. But on this issue, they've actually spoken out fairly clearly, fairly recently, both in their joint statement with the president at the Sunnyland Summit in February, where they made a clear statement in support of the Convention on the Law of the Sea and the right of countries to pursue dispute resolution through all peaceful processes, including legal and diplomatic processes. They've made their own standalone statements through their foreign ministers at their foreign ministerial in April. And we expect them to continue to take that principled line on the importance of the rule of law and international conventions such as the law of the sea.
Finally, is imposing reputational harm the absolute best that we can do? Other than upgrading the maritime security capabilities of our partners in the region, do we have any other tools for inducing behavioral change in the South China Sea?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said, our strategy is multifaceted. It is diplomatic. It's military. It is about capacity building with the other claimants. It's about economic tools, but it's a cumulative, long-term strategy aimed at making clear that the strategic environment is such that it is not in any claimants or any nation's interest to violate international law.
Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. There's only one significantly inhabited island in dispute in the South and East China Sea. It's called Taiwan. A lot more people than all. And one way to defend Taiwan would be to spend a few $100 billion on more naval assets, but there's something else that would be just as effective, probably more effective. And that is a clear law that would immediately eliminate China's most favored nation status if they blockade or invade Taiwan. Under those circumstances, the missiles that China could use on any day to just threaten Taiwan and close its ports would, I think, become inoperative. Ms. Willett, would you oppose, or would the State Department oppose, an effort by Congress to just say, if you invade or blockade Taiwan, at that moment you automatically lose MFN?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm happy to take your question and consult with my colleagues who cover Taiwan policy and come back to you with an answer.
Can I count on a clear, unambiguous answer for the record?
Have to take your question back to my colleagues who cover Taiwan.
I think it was the chairman of our subcommittee that talked about ambiguity. It might be good to be ambiguous toward China, but maybe not ambiguous toward Congress on this issue. I hope to get a clear answer. Mr. Denmark, there has been a massive increase in the world's attention to disputes between Japan and China over islands. Has Japan massively increased its defense budget over the last 4 years? And don't they spend well less than a quarter of what we spend as a percentage of GDP?
Thank you, sir. I don't have the specific numbers in front of me. I do believe it's a percentage of.
It's about 1% of their GDP. They keep claiming they're going to increase it. They never actually increase it. And they want us to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to develop and deploy naval assets to defend islands that don't have any oil, but if they do have oil, it's Japanese oil or Chinese oil. It's not American oil.
In terms of, to answer your question, sir, in terms of absolute numbers, I do believe that Japan's defense budget has increased in recent years, although not dramatically, as you said, sir. But we have seen, I think, very important developments in our alliance with Japan in the last few years with our agreement on new defense guidelines, the passage of new legislation that enables their self-defense.
They're not willing to put their money where they want us to put our money. They're not willing to put their lives where they want us to put our lives. And it's nice that they will issue joint communiques, but joint communiques don't cost anything. Ms. Willett, I want to return to the UNCLOS. I agree with you. It's not about the rocks. It's about the rules. China seems to have it the best of both worlds. They join UNCLOS, serve on the subcommittees, as the gentleman from Virginia pointed out, and yet they're not going to follow the outcome of this arbitration provision. Should we join? I mean, there are various arguments about us not joining UNCLOS, but it seems like China has demonstrated that you can join, participate, and if you disagree with anything they do, well, you just say they didn't have jurisdiction. Is there any mineral rights or fishing rights or anything of value that the United States claims that someone is objecting to in a way that we could lose in UNCLOS? And if so, would we have to recognize the binding power of its decision?
On the China question, Congressman. It is true that China has indicated that it does not accept the jurisdiction of the tribunal.
You can be sure they will accept it if they happen to win.
Our focus is on their behavior following the tribunal decision. Actions matter in this
This
case.
question more is about why shouldn't we join UNCLOS? It seems China is demonstrating that you can participate, you can influence, and you don't really have to follow their rulings. So can you think of any disadvantage to joining UNCLOS? Is there anything we could lose?
Disadvantage to joining UNCLOS?
Yes.
No, our position is that it materially benefits us to be a part of the Convention of the
So
Law
we
of the Sea.
get the benefits. You can't think of anything we could lose, but even if we lost in an arbitration in UNCLOS about some Arctic resource, China is demonstrating that you don't have to follow the ruling. Sounds like a great organization to join.
China has not yet demonstrated that you don't have to follow the ruling. There
They
hasn't
have
been a ruling.
demonstrated that if the ruling goes against them, they will not feel it binding on them.
I'm concerned with their actions after we have an actual decision from the tribunal.
I mean, they may scale back what they do voluntarily for a host of reasons, but it's clear that they've laid the legal foundation to win if they win at UNCLOS and not to feel bound by it if they lose.
They have presented an argument asserting that they are not bound by the tribunal when it rules.
And it
That
is an
not-
incredibly weak argument.
That's
If
correct.
we ever needed to present an argument, we could certainly present one that strong. Their argument is that some other government that they don't recognize once drew a line claiming something. That's like a Confederate general claiming Cuba. And so we claim all of Cuba. It's so again, there are the advantages that the gentleman from Virginia pointed out. What could we possibly lose by joining UNCLOS? I don't know if Mr. Denmark has a comment. I'll see if you have a comment, and then I believe my time has more than expired.
The Convention on the Law of the Sea protects our maritime interests around the world. It's an important legal framework that ensures all countries are able to make use of the seas based on a rules-based system. We firmly believe that it's in the United States' interest to ratify, and we expect all parties to the convention to fulfill their obligations under it.
Okay. I'll just yield to the gentleman for Connecticut to remind us of the HR resolution that allows us to register our belief. That would be 631. And you're allowed to co-sponsor that, right? Oh, it's good to find out. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. The distinguished gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Burns, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Several of us on these two panels were in China together a couple of months ago, and we had the opportunity to have a number of briefings and actually got to hear the Chinese position. And the Chinese position is that we're a weakening power in the Pacific. Now, I don't know that we necessarily have to agree with their assessment, but I think it's important we understand that is their assessment. And it got me to thinking about what Teddy Roosevelt always said, which is walk softly but carry a big stick. A lot of what we've heard today has been about using discretion in the use of power, which is certainly appropriate in any environment, particularly in a sensitive environment like the South China Sea. But I guess the question I have is, do we have a big enough stick over there? Do we have the right military assets in place, in the right place, to do what we need to do to fulfill the objectives of the United States, both militarily and otherwise? We keep having these incidents. The Chinese are clearly pushing very hard. You're from the Department of Defense. Do you have the assets you need to carry out your mission?
Yes, Congressman, I believe we do. And it's interesting you referenced President Roosevelt in that several months ago I had the opportunity to accompany Secretary of Defense Carter to the USS Teddy Roosevelt operating in the region, which the ship calls itself America's Big Stick, which I think is a nice example.
I've also been on that vessel. It has a motto stenciled all throughout it saying, putting warheads on foreheads.
That's right. That's right.
I love that. It's a good motto.
We have, as I mentioned in my testimony, Congressman, we have increased our presence in the region over the last several years. This is responding to a fairly ubiquitous and loud demand signal that we've been hearing from across the region from our allies and our partners, stating that they're concerned about activities and actions happening in the South China Sea and asking us to work with them. And we've answered that call. We are working with them to enhance their capabilities. We're conducting exercises, we're conducting training, we're building our own capabilities in the region. Our operations tempo has increased, and we see that all of these actions are providing for the common good. They're increasing maritime domain awareness and maritime security in the region, supporting our allies and our partners as well as our own national interests. And all of our missions are done meticulously to ensure that everything that we do is done in a way that's compatible and supports international law and maintains safety.
Well, a number of us are going with Mr. Courtney to the RIMPAC exercise in a couple of weeks. I want to go back to that Chinese perception. How do we, if we believe we have the appropriate number of assets, how do we cure that problem? Because a misperception is as dangerous to us as anything else. How do we cure that misperception for the Chinese? Do exercises like RIMPAC help with that, or is there need to be more direct communication between us and them? What's the source of their misunderstanding, and what can we do about it?
Well, Congressman, I do think that RIMPAC is a very good demonstration of American leadership and American power, in that no other country is able to bring together so many countries to work together in pursuit of a common objective. So I think RIMPAC is a terrific example of that. In terms of our interactions with China, we have pursued for several years very consistently a robust military-to-military relationship with them, which includes military diplomacy, in which our senior leaders, their senior leaders from our two militaries interact with each other, both in person and over communications. We visit each other's countries, we visit each other's militaries, and we, from the U.S. perspective, we try to enhance that sort of transparency as a way to ensure, to reduce the potential for misunderstanding and miscalculation. We've also recently agreed to several confidence-building measures on rules of behavior in airspace and on the high seas, which we see as a very important aspect of our efforts to reduce risk. As our militaries operate in closer proximity to one another, to a greater degree of regularity, we see that efforts of risk reduction is very important. In terms of managing Chinese perceptions, as somebody who's studied China for a long time, I find that task to be very complicated and very difficult. What we can be responsible for is to make sure that we're doing the right things, to make sure that we have the capabilities in the places that we need, to make sure that we're building the capabilities of our allies and partners, and make sure that we're able to defend ourselves, defend our allies, and defend our interests. I believe we are.
Thank you. Now you're back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Bear, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Throughout the opening statements and certainly throughout the witnesses' opening comments, there's a theme of the importance of recognizing global rules and norms and understanding the mechanisms by which to resolve disputes. So I think many of us in Congress have been concerned when we look at China's unilateral moves, whether in the East China Sea or in the South China Sea, which really go against international norms. In unilateral moves, whether it's the Scarborough Shoals or declaring ADAs over the East China Sea, which really go outside the norms. So if we just think about the next steps and what is in our toolbox as the United States to help de-escalate tensions. I think it's reasonable to go ahead and, we should certainly, I do wish we were part of UNCLOS. We're not, but we are going through the process of recognizing international norms and international mechanisms by which to resolve disputes. So ruling will come out shortly. I think it behooves us to make sure as an international community, when we see that ruling, we do everything we can to enforce that ruling. Now, what I would say is, let's say that ruling is not the one China is looking for, and they choose to ignore that ruling. If we look at, I think, Ms. Willett, you talked about the tools that we have. We're already engaged diplomatically in the sense that, we've gone to UNCLOS. I would consider that a diplomatic tool by which to resolve this dispute. We can continue to engage diplomatically, but we've already used that tool. None of us is interested in a military or kinetic engagement. We certainly are posturing by having some of our assets in the region. And the importance of the South China Sea, the reason why these small reclaimed islands are so important is that is one of the most important trade routes in the world right now. It is of incredibly economic importance to not only the United States, but to our allies in that region, and the number of goods that move through that region are incredibly important, so they're very strategic. We can try to use economic tools to get China back to the table, but the worry here is, China increasingly is moving assets to that island, and the more assets they have, the harder it will be to move them off of those islands. And it is much easier for us to deal with this today than it will be a decade from now. So, Mr. Denmark, outside of that, what are our options?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think you can understand why I would be reluctant to discuss military options to any degree of specificity in an open hearing. What I do feel comfortable saying in an open setting is that we remain very committed to continue to defend our allies, to defend critical principles that we see as necessary to the continued peace and stability of the region, and to continue to defend our national interests. In terms of what happens after a decision, I think I would refer you to the statement that I submitted, in that we see the military role in this as being essential to deter conflict, ensure that diplomacy has space to succeed. And we're going to continue to play that role.
And certainly there's no desire for a military option here. I mean, we want diplomacy, and we certainly want China to understand that it's in China's economic benefit to have open seaways and the free movement of goods and services. They obviously see that as well. So, from our perspective, let's hope, adhering to international norms and international mechanisms by which to resolve dispute, that China, will take that mechanism as a member of UNCLOS, and adhere to whatever ruling we do see next week. Again, otherwise, I think we ought to come back into a joint committee here and really send a strong message that we've got to adhere to these international norms. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking at the South China Sea, there appear to be a number of nations that have significant economic and perhaps security interests. How would you rank those in terms of importance? Let's talk about it in terms of economics. Which countries use the South China Sea the most, perhaps for fishing, food, commerce, oil, things of that nature?
Thank you, Congressman. It's a a big, complicated question. There are a number of claimants. They all have different, or not all, but they have varying claims. They have varying ways that they assess the values of those claims. I think.
I'm not asking about claims. I'm
No,
talking about who
I understand,
uses.
but the geographic scope of individual claims impacts how they assess the value of the resources and the importance of those spaces. Which is all to say, it's a complicated answer.
What is your judgment?
From a U.S. perspective, what's most important and what's driving these disputes varies very much from country to country. From our perspective, what's most important is whether or not they are going to pursue those claims in a way
Okay,
that's
Mr.
consistent with
Denmark, I'm
international
not
law.
getting an answer. Perhaps you can share with me your insight on which countries have the greatest amount of economic interest in the South China Sea. It might be oil being shipped through the South China Sea that they're dependent on. It might be unfinished or finished products. It might be food in the form of fishing. Do you have a judgment as to which countries have the greatest economic interest in the South China Sea?
Well, Congressman, it's a very interesting question. I don't believe I've seen an academic analysis that tries to rank these. What I have seen, though, is that the complexities of international trade in this region means that it's not just the claimants that are affected, although obviously they have a critical interest in it, but countries outside of even the immediate area of the South China Sea, like Japan, like South Korea, like the United States, also have a critical interst in
Well,
what happens there.
let's talk
But-
about it for a moment. South Korea, what is their interest in the South China Sea?
Well, obviously, I can't speak for them.
I understand you cannot speak to them. Do you have no judgment?
I do. What I would say is my sense is that all countries in the region. I wouldn't want to identify one specifically. I'd say all countries in the region have.
You know, I thought this was an easy question. South Korea, do they rely on their oil shipments from the Persian Gulf and from other areas to go through the South China Sea?
So what I was going to say that South Korea, Japan, most of the countries of the region rely tremendously on international trade, much of which flows through the South China Sea.
Okay, let's try to get to some specifics. And I've already lost about 70% of my time. South Korea, oil shipments through the South China Sea. Do they have other commerce that is shipped to or from South Korea through the South China Sea?
Congressman, as I'm not trying to not answer your question. It's as a representative.
Well,
of
the answer is
Department
yes or no, or you don't know.
What I'll say is, as a representative of the Department of Defense, I don't have those figures with me here.
Well, I'm not asking for specific figures. Ms. Willett, are you familiar with whether or not South Korea ships or receives product through the South China Sea, other than oil? We've already established oil.
All countries in East Asia receive and ship goods and services, oil, and liquid natural gas through the South China Sea.
Fair to say that South Korea has a significant interest then in the South China Sea?
Yes, I believe about 30% of the liquid natural gas that gets shipped to South Korea and Japan goes through the South China Sea. About 25% of the world's goods.
And
trade.
Japan also has a significant economic interest.
Yes, Congressman.
And the Philippines has a significant economic interest.
Yes, sir.
Vietnam has a significant economic interest.
Yes.
Taiwan has a significant economic interest.
Yes, all countries in East Asia have a significant.
And would it be fair to say that their economic interest on a percentage of GDP is greater than that of the United States of America? Economic interest.
I would have to go back and look at the specifics because a great deal of this trade is also bound for the United States.
What can the United States of America do to encourage these other countries that have a greater reliance on shipping through the South China Sea to step up to the plate and absorb more of the defense costs associated with those shipping lanes?
We work very closely with all of these countries on diplomatic, military, economic approaches to ensuring that the rules are followed in the South China Sea.
But they aren't stepping up to the plate like the United States of America is. My question is, what can we get them to do to step up to the plate to measures that are commensurate with their economic interests?
We continue to engage with all of our partners in the region to ensure that we are all playing a part in ensuring that a rules-based order is protected in the South China Sea.
If the United States of America were to withdraw its military assets in the South China Sea, would that encourage these other countries to step up to the plate?
I think that's a question for those other countries. I'm sorry, sir.
All right, thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Guam is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Forbes and Salmon, for holding this important and timely hearing. 2 weeks ago, I had the pleasure of meeting with Prime Minister of Timor-Leste to discuss a variety of bilateral issues. In particular, Secretary Willett, I would like to briefly note my concern regarding the outstanding maritime dispute between Australia and Timor-Leste. I believe the United States should use our diplomatic power and influence to bring about a swift resolution to this matter. And the lack of an agreement on this maritime dispute undermines our credibility when discussing the issue of the South China Sea maritime issues with the Chinese. I do know the Chinese raise this very often. So I hope that we can use some of our influence to encourage a swift resolution to the matter. And I think the political will exists in the region if we can just need to nudge this along. So I know Mr. Courtney has introduced a resolution to this matter, and I will also add my name to the chorus of people who believe the Senate should ratify UNCLOS. Now, my first question is for, I guess, Secretary Denmark. I believe that an asymmetric advantage we have in countering Chinese influence in the South China Sea is the partnerships that we have in the region, and we should continue to cultivate them. Are programs such as the Maritime Security Initiative a helpful tool for building partner capacity, and what areas can be improved? I'm particularly concerned that we can find over $3 billion for the European Reassurance Initiative program, but we struggled to find $100 million for the Maritime Security Initiative. Now, you briefly touched on MSI in your testimony, Secretary Denmark, but I think this disparity sends the wrong message about our rebalance strategy, especially given your commentary on the need for building partner capacity. Do you agree? If you could just give it a brief answer. Sure. I have very little time.
Sure. We believe that MSI is very important and something that we've been working very actively to help train equip our allies and partners. I agree with you that our allies and partners are a critical advantage to us in the region. And we're just in the beginning of this effort, and we're looking to continue to advance it.
So you do agree then. Secretary Denmark, my final question is for you. On Guam, we are particularly concerned with the PLA Navy's increased presence in the South China Sea and the high number of unsafe aerial and maritime intercepts they are conducting. Could you elaborate on the steps that the Department is taking to, 1A, reduce Chinese intercepts, and B, create a roadmap for de-escalating potential conflicts resulting from a botched Chinese reaction?
Sure. Yes, of course. As I've mentioned before, we've recently concluded several confidence-building measures with the Chinese, which are designed to reduce risk in terms of setting rules of behavior for interactions between our aircraft and our surface vessels based on existing international laws and norms. And we have seen an increase in the number of interactions between our forces in recent years, primarily because both sides are more active in the region militarily. But at the same time, we've seen a decrease in unsafe intercepts between our two sides, which I think demonstrates the effectiveness of these efforts. So we're going to continue to work with China to continue to advance these efforts to reduce risk, to enhance our ability to communicate with one another.
Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. So I was just wondering, has China adopted the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea? And so they are
Yes, Congresswoman, that they were integral in the drafting of the Convention on the Law of the Sea and have ratified it.
Ratified, okay. So they should abide by that, no question, obviously. Has the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea ever ruled for a shared claim between countries? Could that be something potentially they would do next week?
The tribunal, in this instance, won't rule on the underlying question of sovereignty over the individual land features. What it will do is potentially clarify what maritime entitlements those features are entitled to, among other issues. I would have to go back and look at the history of previous tribunals and get back to you on your question, but it's not, at the moment, the issue at question isn't who owns the land feature, but what maritime space is generated from a land feature. Is it a territorial sea or an exclusive economic zone?
Okay, very good. How avoidable have recent near misses between U.S. and Chinese air and sea craft been? And do you believe these incidents indicate that we are likely to see additional tense military encounters?
Well, Congresswoman, as I mentioned, we've actually seen, well, the number of interactions between our aircraft and vessels in international places have increased in recent months and years. We have seen a decrease in the number of unsafe interactions between our two sides. As a result, I believe, of the risk reduction efforts that we've conducted. But as our forces continue to operate in relatively close proximity to one another, it's an issue that we're going to continue to be focused on. And these efforts at risk reduction are something that we're going to continue to pursue with the PLA.
So back to the claim, a lot of my colleagues have advocated that the Senate adopt UNCLOS. And how would you respond to the concerns that I have heard that it would jeopardize American sovereignty by subjugating some of our rights to the UN, and also perhaps jeopardize our fishing industry and the ability to fish certain areas? How would you respond to those concerns?
It's our view, the Obama administration and the previous administrations, that the legal framework offered by the Convention on the Law of the Sea protects U.S. maritime interests and protects our rights around the world. On the specifics of what our accession and a ratification of the treaty might look like, I wouldn't want to speculate that that is something I think that would be part of the Senate deliberations.
Would you like to add anything?
If I could just add, from a DoD perspective, our military forces, even though we have not ratified UNCLOS, our military forces do operate in accordance with its guidelines, and we're actually very meticulous to make sure that all of our operations are conducted within the bounds of international law.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Graham, is recognized for a little less than 5 minutes.
I won't even take that long, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Both of the chairmen, thank you for this opportunity. Ms. Willett, you mentioned that the United States will be looking at China's actions following conclusion of arbitration. You know, aside from the obvious, and I will say that it has surprised me somewhat this hearing. I've been here from the beginning because it seems like the witnesses that y'all are somewhat hesitant, and I'm assuming because of the sensitivity of the subject we're discussing. So I don't know if maybe this would be better addressed in a classified, Mr. Chairman. But aside from the obvious, what actions will y'all be looking at from China's perspective that would signal noncompliance?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think the hesitance comes in part from the fact that it's a complicated legal question that's been put before the tribunal, and we do not have a ruling yet from the body that we could evaluate or even assess, what noncompliance might look like. Thus far, our efforts have been focused on engaging intensively with China, with the other claimants, with the other interested parties in the region, to ensure that following the ruling, everyone behaves with restraint. Everyone is looking for ways to use the tribunal decision as a jumping off point to restart diplomatic discussions about a common way forward that avoids conflict, but looks for commonalities that can be built on, so that in these disputed spaces, we can reduce the risk of misunderstanding and find a way for all of the parties involved to benefit and to behave in a manner that's consistent with international law, but that doesn't and isn't in violation of whatever the ruling is. But until we see the ruling, it's difficult to speculate on just what its implications are.
Am I on now? Yes. And I think that's a fair comment. However, I'll segue to something Mr. Denmark says. I certainly hope that, and I'll end with this, that if in fact there is a failure to live up to what our expectations are following the decision, unknowing what the decision is at this point, but I think we can all extrapolate out what would be a violation, that we do have, and you said, Mr. Denmark, that we are making sure we have the capabilities where we need them. And I wrote that down, make sure we have the capabilities where we need them. And I think that is a key statement, because clearly this is an area in the world where there is a lot of potential international implications if, in fact, they do not fulfill their obligations, being China. So I'll end with that. I don't really think there's a need to have a follow-up response, and I appreciate y'all being here. Thank you very much.
We want to thank you both for being here. I told you at the beginning that we would allow you time to have any final comments. Unfortunately, these votes are called. So what I'm going to allow you to do, if you'd like to, is to submit anything for the record to clarify any statements you've made or to put anything else in there that you feel we didn't cover that you thought was important. Is that okay with both the ranking members and with the chairman? And with that, the other members have said they do not need to return to ask their questions, so we're going to let you guys go. Thank you so much for being here. With that, we're adjourned.